This is CLIL Discussion 15 Two Languages in the Classroom, recorded on the 12th of January 2011. I'll go quickly around and ask you just to say where you're from and what you teach, so you all know who each other is, just to get us going. Egbert, tell us who you are and what you teach.
Hello, I'm Egbert. I'm a science teacher in Kassel in Germany, and I work also as a teacher trainer in biology in what we call gymnasium, that is type grammar school from grade 5 to grade 12. And I'm in touch with ASE on a project called Science Across the World since a lot of years.
Okay, Phil, perhaps I've got you next in the list. Tell us who you are and what you teach.
Okay, I don't actually teach. My background is teacher training, but ELT teacher training. But I'm currently managing the ALP, the Academic Language Support Program in Qatar, which is working with maths and science teachers to help them to deliver maths and science content through the medium of English.
Okay, thank you. And Patty, next in line.
Yes, hi. I'm a trained primary school teacher, primary and special education teacher, and currently I'm working as a teacher trainer, mostly with primary, some secondary teachers, mostly about CLIL and how to work teaching other subjects in English. I'm also now working with pre-service bilingual teachers, which is interesting, at a university here in Spain.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then Liz and John come next in line.
Hi, I'll speak just on this one occasion. Phil has just set the background for us. We work with Phil. We're senior trainers on the ALP project and doing CLIL stuff with the Qatari teachers, well, the teachers in Qatar here, mostly Egyptian and other Arab nationalities, teaching science and math, so we're helping them to do that in English. That's our job.
Thank you, thank you. And is Liz there with you, John?
Yes.
Okay, and then we've got Phil Ball, Felipe, as he's become known next.
Hi, yes, I live in the Basque Country in Spain. I've been here for 20 years, and I work as a teacher trainer and materials writer with the Federation of Basque Schools, and sometimes with the Basque government, mainly working in secondary, but also moving into tertiary stuff with CLIL, with the kind of growing demand that's taking place here. But mostly working in secondary with Basque medium schools who are working in multilingual projects. So that's how I came into CLIL.
Okay, thanks, Phil. And then we come to Wendy. Wendy.
Hi there. Hi, Liz and John and Felipe and all of you.
Hi, Wendy.
See you very much.
Hi there.
Hi there.
Hello.
I'm Wendy, and I live in England now, and I do teacher training and materials writing. Not always CLIL. The most recent CLIL work that I've done was helping to write an online CLIL course, which started yesterday or today. So that's going to be really interesting to see how that goes on.
Okay, thanks. And I'm Keith, and I think I know everybody quite well. I teach and write and train, and this Café CLIL, it's actually been running now for over 2 years, and this is our 15th discussion. And on the agenda today, two languages in the classrooms is a very vague theme, but really has stemmed from a message from Teresa Ting in the Fact Words e-group, which draws a division between CLIL and immersion, with a couple of links to articles, which I've uploaded to our Café CLIL page for this discussion, which also go on to describe CLIL very differently from immersion approaches. So our theme is going to look at dealing with multiple languages in the classroom, but it also may take us into defining more clearly what we mean when we talk about CLIL. Now, I sent out to everybody a bullet point list of prompts, and we do this every discussion. We don't have to stick to these prompts, it's always more interesting if we go off in another direction, led by one of you, really telling stories about your experiences. And I'm very happy for us to do that. So while I sit and chair, do feel free to go off in whatever direction your interest takes you. What I suggest I do is I'll read through the bullet points quickly, and then I'll ask if there's something you want to jump in on and get the ball rolling. The bullet points start with monolingual monocultural versus multilingual multicultural classrooms, similarities and differences, and that relates also to the Lasagabasta article in Sierra in the LTJ in October, where they actually say CLIL is not immersion. Ideals and realities. I think it's always interesting to hear some stories from you. If you've got examples and memories of lessons you've seen where you would say something about good or bad practice for dealing with multiple languages in the classroom. Giving time and space for two languages in the classroom, questions of management and prioritizing. We might talk about how this may change within CLIL classrooms with early learners through to university classrooms. Student profiling and monitoring I've got in the list as well. Information gathering in the classroom and how that can feed back into deciding what comes next in terms of languages and prioritizing language within a CLIL classroom. Published materials. Some of you might have information that we can say on air, and then I'll write up in the minutes with references to any books or articles or links that you might want colleagues to visit. There does tend to be very little available. You might have some good stories to tell us that would be good to share. And differentiation was last in the list. I thought it might be useful for us to explore differentiation because there are bound to be many, many levels of language in any one CLIL classroom. Would someone like to jump in and choose a theme and get us started? I'm quite happy to provoke discussion if you'd like me to. I mean, what do you think about the Lasagabasta and Sierra? They actually do state immersion is not CLIL. CLIL is not immersion in this article, and then they go on to list similarities and differences, and actually say that using an umbrella term which incorporates both of these is confusing and actually unhelpful. Go ahead, anybody.
Yeah, it's Felipe here. Yeah, it's since Lasagabasta's from my neck of the woods, I guess I ought to really jump in to some extent there, although I read the article some time ago. I think they're basically right. I don't think immersion has ever been CLIL, but then again, immersion's been around for, let's say in an official sense for a lot longer. The problem is with things like CLIL is that references tend to always be taken back to things like the Genesee Snow project in Canada. The Canada Immersion Project tends to be taken as such a standard model that it's sometimes difficult to escape from it, and the conclusions that were made from that as well. But I think David's very right to draw the distinction. And I think that I've been rattling on now for a few years about also trying to free CLIL a bit of the shackles of other approaches and methodologies, let's say, as well, and to try to make it clearer that it has its own parameters. And I think that there's a relationship between those two things. But let's stay on the point here. I mean, obviously in immersion, if you go back to the Canadian project, I guess that obviously back then it was very much tied to probably the emerging communicative movement, where it was seen as meet and as appropriate to develop those languages bilingually, but in solitude. I think that's a great phrase that Cummings uses, bilingualism, but you have two languages still separated in a sense. And obviously when your objective is, I suppose, to create functional and CALPI academic bilinguals, as was the case in Canada, let's say, and often is the case in immersion, then there is a good case. I mean, you could argue that there's a good case, as long as it's methodologically agreed on by teachers and the policy's coherent. There's a good case for separating the languages. There's obviously a good case for separating languages if you go down the street to your English academy where the kids are coming after the school and attempting to increase their contact with the target language. Again, you can argue this, but the whole translanguaging thing, the whole CLIL thing, it's broken all this up, I think, in so many ways, I think, as David was pointing out, and it doesn't seem any longer, relevant to talk about languages, in solitude, to use Cummings' phrase. So that's just a little intro there. Can you still hear me? I've got some weird interference.
Yeah, there is a kind of wind blowing. Maybe it's the desert.
Sounds like there's a hurricane in Bulgaria, is it, or something?
No, I think it's the desert in the Middle East.
Sandstorm in Qatar.
Yeah, to bring us back to the La Saga Basque and Sierra article, I don't know if everybody's managed to get access to it, but the differentiation is very clear, and the similarities are very clear as well. And one of them, I don't know if you would agree or disagree with, is the fact that CLIL classrooms are generally non-native speaker teacher classrooms, as opposed to generally native speaker classrooms in the immersion world.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously that's going to have a lot of influence on method, materials, and language as well.
Hi, Keith.
Oh, you're back in. I thought I'd lost you.
No, we're still here. That wind you're talking about has been blowing around Qatar, actually. It is a bit of a sandstorm going on. Well, hell of a wind anyway. Anyway, yeah, the language business, 2 languages in the classroom. That's, as you're well aware, I think all of you, except maybe Egbert, I don't know, is very much the case in the CLIL context that we're working in, and absolutely has to be the case, because the teachers can't communicate well enough, deal well enough with the concepts that they have to teach in the CLIL language, in English, so they resort to Arabic when they need to, and as far as we're concerned, nothing wrong with that. I think from what I gathered from the skimming of the articles that you posted, there's no problem with people. The general feeling is now that you should resort to the mother tongue when you need to, and in our context that is relatively frequently. And what we have to try and do in our sessions with the science and maths teachers is try to figure out some ground rules for when it's okay to, when it's necessary to, when they should feel that it's a good idea, and how you go about it and for what purposes. That's really the question, not whether you can or whether you can't. It's simply the best way to do so.
In Teresa Ting's posting in the Factboard group, she actually drew attention to those 2 questions. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how much and what and how. Basically.
Can I come in there?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Just to say, comment on what John's just said. I mean, I worked on the ALP project as well, and what John says is quite true. I think that you've got to be slightly careful. John used the word resorting to, which is, I think there's a slight problem there in the sense that if you're resorting to, it's not necessarily a kind of coherent policy. I mean, what John did say at the end quite rightly was that there have to be ground rules. But I think that if you start from a position of, say you decide to program your CLIL program, decide to work your CLIL program around some sort of translanguaging idea, and come on to that later, then it's better than resorting to. I mean, I accept, of course, that there are so many realities that you might have to resort to, but the trouble is that, I'd like to see the classroom management. I always want to see the classroom management that's behind resorting to, one would rather see the policy as a coherent one, like, say in the Basque Country, for example, you've obviously here, what you've got is a minority language in a bi-official bi-official situation, Spanish and Basque. But you've only really got 1 million Basque speakers, and of course the language was prohibited for 40 years. So it's just impossible to have enough materials writers around to produce enough materials to just cope with the multimedia demands of education these days. And so, of course, why not resort in the classroom to reading an article in Spanish, but commenting on it in Basque, for example. I mean, that's one of the that's you're beginning to look at a coherent policy there of using more than one language in the classroom. So I'm not getting a jump there, but what you don't want is teachers just basically deciding to allow the L1 to be used because people aren't coping. I mean, people aren't coping in many contexts, of course, but that's a problem, not a solution. See what I mean?
Can I come in here? It's Noreen.
Go ahead, Noreen. Welcome.
Thank you. I've worked in a couple of CLIL contexts, one in Amsterdam, and I'm now here in Doha. And what I'd like to add is awareness of learning and awareness of language, and knowing when the L1 is being used, the purpose for which is being used, and how it is being used. And so I think if we were to put the questions how and why under the analysis of and awareness of language and awareness of learning, then I'd be happy with some sort of coherent policy which looks at that.
Yeah.
And I also...
Go ahead, Liz.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Liz.
Okay. Yeah, we do actually here deal with the use of L1 quite explicitly on our courses. And I think we need to discriminate as well between teachers' use of L1 and learners' use of L1, because there are different grounds for it. But if you like, our ground rules are, we give them an image of different layers of language going on in the classroom. We use a concentric circle model, and it moves in from English for personal interaction, or BIC, into the heart of the circle, which is CAL. And what we try to say to them, where they are using the L2 for low risk, if you like, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but where comprehensibility is not 100% necessary, then they should stick with the L2, because it's providing masses of exposure, and as I said, they don't need to understand every word. When they get into the heart of the circle, when it becomes pure Calci, then they may well use the L1, because that's high risk. Content has to remain, well, here anyway, in our context, the primary objective. And so that's where we do encourage the switch to L1 when necessary.
When necessary.
Hi, can I say something?
Necessary is to do with their perception of when learning is happening, and that's another thing some of them are not really very good at. But when they can see, a sensitive teacher can see that the concept is being sacrificed, maybe because of linguistic ability of the learners, and then switching to kind of a section of the lesson to confirm that learning has taken place via the L1 is what I would say is often necessary.
You see, I'll bring Patty in a moment, because she did try to say something. But I just wondered if you see in your work techniques that teachers use to signify that switch, or does it happen quite quickly and randomly, or are there techniques to signpost, right, we're going to move into?
I think it's something that I've been more aware of lately, actually, doing lots and lots of school visits. No, very often they don't have a strategy for signalling which language they're going to use, and I've been encouraging them in primary to use one side of the board and stand at one side of the board when they're using L2 and switch to the other side of the board when they're using L1. They can do the same with written reinforcement on the board, or wear different hats, or something like that.
Patty, you want to
Yes,
say
no,
something?
just exactly what you're talking about, signposting. I've seen teachers use signs in the classroom that have the different languages of the group. For example, let's say in Barcelona, it said English, Spanish, Catalan, or any language, because this was a situation where the children were from many different countries. And so any of the teachers could use this during the time they were with the children. And depending on what the task was, because if it's a new concept, a new academic concept, the children may need to go through it, work through it together in a mutual first language that they have. So the teacher may say, okay, for 5 minutes you're going to talk to your partner about what we've just read in English, but you're going to do your talking in any language that you like. And so it was a specific time, a specific task, using that. And then after that, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about it in English. And there was actually a sign with the languages, and an arrow was moved from which language we're using and when and why. And if the objective is to practice a new structure that we've been learning, even if it's a science class, sometimes we have to practice the language of that subject, then this activity is going to be done 100% in English. I've given you the structures. You have them on the board. So during this time, everybody's going to work in English. And so very clearly marking out how those languages were to be used and for how long and what the different options were, which I think is quite a nice technique.
Yep, sounds really good.
Good.
I'm trying to figure out who's speaking.
No, that was John. That was me, Keith. I just said I thought that sounded really good. I think one of the difficulties that we have, which you and Phil and Felipe are very familiar with, is the kind of control that the teacher, particularly in secondary, may have in the classroom. You can have all the signs you want, but it's not going to stop any group work reverting to mother tongue if the kids are not really interested in it, or if they're struggling. You may have a designated period when you're going to say, you know, this task has got to be 100% English. It's very difficult to enforce something like that. And going back to what Felipe was saying, coherent policy, I absolutely agree. You know, ground rules for when it's useful, pedagogically sound to be using one or the other. But these are things that are going to change, I guess, between contexts, between cultures where the kids are strongly motivated, the age of the kids, and a dozen other different variables.
Yes, of course. Sorry, can I?
No, go on, Patty, go on.
Okay, sorry, thanks, Phil. When you said that, you know, different cultures and different situations, obviously that's a huge influence. But I've worked in pretty much bilingual classes where most of the children were Spanish and the class was in English. I've also worked in international situations where everybody has a different mother tongue and some are native English speakers. And like you said, group work would almost always turn into the L1 of whatever the students were. And I've been to conferences of international school teachers where we've had experts like Jim Cummins and Stephen Krashen at our disposal, and that was a big question that lots of people have, because obviously it happens everywhere. And their answers, as the experts, was that, first of all, you have to group your students strategically. You know, if you have students of different languages and your objective is that they use the target language, to group them in a way that they are mixed, or that you have mixed abilities. But also that it's not necessarily a bad thing for students to work through an L2 task in the L1, as long as the product has to be in the L2, because their reasoning was they'll understand better, they'll be more efficient by working through it in the L1, and that they have to do the product, whether it's a presentation or a poster or a piece of writing, it has to be in the target language. So they'll be using that first language to get to the second language. And none of them saw a problem with that. They all said that it was fine as long as it is, as you said, done in an organized way.
I mean, the methodology that Cummins and colleagues publishing now, multi-literacy approaches to education, do actually suggest that working with the other language or languages is actually part of the methodology. And there's a lot of reference to translation work within story writing, for example. It's the example I pulled out from the article I've put of Cummins in the list.
Yes, he called them.
And in a way, I think my own take on CLIL is quite old-fashioned, because I always think of it as the mechanics of the English language, the nuts and bolts, and then providing all that equipment to learners in a very structured way. But actually, I think the suggestion in much of the literature that I posted on the site is that we need a pedagogy that incorporates the multiple languages within the approach that the teacher has for teaching the subject. And that's something that I openly admit is I don't actually practice that.
Can I come in there, Keith? Interesting points being raised here. Just to go back to what Noreen said briefly there about the how and the why, I think that maybe we've got to move on to that now, because of course we started out by talking about immersion and CLIL, but really what we're talking about here is, what we've said in the last 20 minutes, of course, would come over as anathema to a standard language teacher, because a standard language teacher is taught that a language class has to maximise the target language and both the input and the output of both learner and teacher. And so, of course, we're on different grounds here, and we of course we're coming from I'm certainly coming from a CLIL perspective, and you are as well. And so obviously, we recognise that it's different. But as Noreen said, what's the how and what's the why? Well, it would depend, of course, whether you were taking on CLIL in your situational context for mainly linguistic or for conceptual reasons, if you see what I mean. So if you take weak CLIL, which we haven't talked about yet, if you take language teachers taking up content, which I'm still a bit sceptical about, of course, they would be treating this conversation rather differently, I suspect. We're talking here about subject teachers and content teachers who are dealing with very different situations. As John McMahon's quite rightly said, Liz. And therefore you have to work out policies either pragmatically and then coherently. But surely because your objectives are conceptual, what you want at the end of the day, at the end of the lesson, at the end of the week, at the end of the unit, is for the students to understand the concepts as well as the students are understanding them in the native language down the road. So you can't compromise on these kind of things. You have to teach the concepts, and so you're using this, let's say, code switching or two-language policy or translanguaging in order, in the end, to teach those concepts successfully. If you're a language teacher just bringing in a bit of content, I doubt very much whether you'd be participating in this conversation. See what I mean?
But it depends sorry.
Go ahead, Liz.
I just said, it's Noreen. It depends on what you want the students to know and what you want them to be able to do. And if you have that fundamental view of an overview of the curriculum, this is what I want them to know, and this is what I want them to be able to do, it's much easier to form then a coherent policy about translanguaging.
Yes,
and
that's what I mean, yes.
This is our difficulty about having a curriculum overview with such precision. And I suppose a backward design process is what we need for CLIL in different contexts.
But would you agree, addressing all of you as a group, would you agree with the following then, that a CLIL approach which pays attention and gives time and space to two languages or more languages in the classroom will disappear the more the second languages become fluent in the learners in the classroom? Because in European context, my feeling is that subject teachers who teach through a foreign language, and it's predominantly English, don't pay a lot of attention to the mother tongue. It's a question of vocabulary lists, and not a lot more. They don't really go into conceptual explanation very much.
I think, Keith, it will depend there if I can just jump in, before I forget. It would depend why you'd taken on CLIL. If you look at it, countries take on CLIL for very distinct reasons. If you go to a place like Holland, for example, where everybody speaks English pretty well on a functional level, you can the dustbin man, the barman, the professor, and whatever, they all speak decent English. Then you haven't taken on CLIL in a place like Holland in order to simply increase the contact time in the target language. You know, what you've done surely is you've taken on English, for example, in a CLIL context in order to fine-tune perhaps the cowpens of stuff, you know, to look more at the academic language and to fine-tune it. That's what the Dutch do, I'm quite sure, and that's what they tell me to do. If you look at the Basque Country or in Spain in general, it's not the case. You know, English is much less widespread and much less efficiently spoken in general. So you know, it's a slight problem. You know, if you say the better the language gets, the less that policy will take place. You're implying that translanguaging, code switching, etc., I suppose, as John and Liz were saying, takes place where the learners have a more defective level, I suppose, of the target language. Well, maybe, but I don't think that's generally the case. Now, like what I said before, in the Basque Country, you just haven't got the materials, and so it's very difficult to work in multimedia, for example, at secondary level, using Basque. You know, it's difficult. So often when you've got Basque Spanish bilingual situations, it seems insane not to use the resources at your disposal, maybe in Spanish and English, and then use Basque. So I think it depends a little bit on the socio-linguistic context that you're talking about.
And the financial, the economic, because I'm sure that plays a part.
I don't know about that. I mean, that's not a criterion I think is particularly relevant to most of developed Europe. It's
the economic background of the children or the teachers.
The economic background of the children and the teachers, I think, does play a part, because this may sound a bit passive, but also it may have an effect on the academic background of the teachers and the students. So I think it is both economic background of students and teachers and the academic background of students and teachers.
Egbert, can I bring Egbert in? Because Egbert, as a chemistry teacher and trainer working in English in Germany, will have opinions to say about all of this, I think.
Today we have a group of merely language teachers teaching CLIL in context of content. But I'm coming from the other side. I'm teaching content using English, and I'm not a certified English language teacher. And the problem in Germany is reflects or mirrors this discussion. We mostly have language teachers entering the content area with their second subject they have done at university. And as we have only a really small group of teachers with science and language subjects from university, there are two groups teaching with English in content situations. Language teachers on the one hand is the greatest number, and a smaller group of science teachers using English in their lesson, and they always have to accept a second language when discussion is too complex, when the context is too complex, because we are only allowed to teach bilingual or CLIL structure if we focus on the content, and the language is the second, the minor aspect of this lesson.
Some of the teachers I've observed here in Bulgaria, and I'm thinking back to when I've seen them use the mother tongue, as opposed to really just teaching immersively in their classrooms. It comes back to vocabulary and concepts, and focusing on new terms, and then they'll have perhaps a quick stop, switch back into the mother tongue, deal with the new term in the mother tongue, and then switch back quickly into English, and carry on with the lesson after taking that pit stop, basically, to make sure that the whole class is happy with this new concept.
Right, Keith?
Sure.
Could I? Yeah. Can I just briefly go back to what Patty was talking about and the advice given by Cummings and Stephen Krashen? Far be it from me to disagree with such august professionals. However, I think the essence of what she was saying, or what they were saying, I think, was that it's okay for the discussion in the group when they're trying to get to a resolution of the task to go on in the mother tongue, so long as the product is in the L2, is in the CLIL language.
Yeah.
I don't know. That sounds, I can't quite go along with that, because a large part of what we want to see happening is the students using the language for learning, and that's what's going to go on when they're trying to come to an understanding of a task that they're working on in the group. The exchange of ideas, the contradicting with each other about the best way forward, the cognition that's going on there is, showing that they can do that in the CLIL language is a vital part of what we're trying to achieve, and goes to the heart of the circles that Liz was talking about, the CAL. So in the CLIL classroom, in the content classroom, I would far rather see that the tasks being done in the CLIL language. And Liz is demanding the mic from me, so here she is.
Go ahead, Liz.
Not demanding at all. I wanted to go back to something you were saying, Keith, about that kind of the pattern that you've observed is teaching to the L1 to confirm vocabulary, etc. I think this is where we have to bear in mind the age at which CLIL is introduced. And in my observation of CLIL at very early primary, that doesn't happen because there is no need and no point in doing that, because these children are learning their maths and science in English from the very beginning. So when they're taught the word hypotenuse or whatever, there's no point in switching to Arabic, because it has no more significance to them than hypotenuse, because that all of their vocabulary relating to maths and science is learned in English. So the L1 in that context doesn't actually support the learning. In that context, the L1 can be switched to for other reasons, for reassurance, for comfort, for security. It's almost the diametric opposite of when you're switching to CLIL teaching with a grade 10 class, for example, who's always studied their maths and science in the L1. That's when the real challenges in switching becomes an issue, I think. Sorry, back to John.
Can I? Oh, sorry, John, go on.
No, you jump in, Phil.
Okay. No, I agree absolutely, and I like what Liz says there. I think that, often in secondary, particularly like in the Qatar situation, or as in the Basque Country, reverting or resorting to the L1 would often be, both from the teacher and learner perspective, for pragmatic and affective reasons, as Liz implies. But there's a further aspect here, isn't there? And we haven't got onto it yet. But of course, it's assessment, and of course, as we all know, you can't escape assessment. And if the assessment of the students at the end of the week, at the end of the term, at the end of the year, is in the target language in the L2, and that assessment is very much testing that conceptual level at the same level, and it has to be if it's real CLIL, as the native speakers down the road, then compromising on the L1 can be a problem. I think that's what Liz is also implying, and I would agree with her. And I think that's why we've got to be very careful here when we're talking about the use of 2 or even 3 languages in the case of the Basque Country in the lesson. Because if you let it go and if you're not coherent, then it just becomes an anarchic mess. And when you get to do the testing, you're going to get bad results.
Let me ask you about that testing point, Phil, because with so diverse colleagues and backgrounds here in our group, it'd be interesting to ask each of you, what's the situation in countries you visited? Because in Bulgaria, the teaching of subjects in foreign languages is very clear. It stops 2 years before the students leave school, and then they go back to Bulgaria and prepare for their school leaving and university entrance exams in their mother tongue, in their subjects. So it's very clear. They have immersion in a subject in a foreign language when they start secondary school, and then they stop to prepare for it in Bulgarian. I know in Austria now students are being offered their Matura exams as an option through English. I wonder what it's like in other countries.
Can I just...
Yeah, please.
Phil?
Yeah, sorry. I'd like to just say something there, which I think is a very interesting discussion about where we want to go with this. Because I was thinking, as people were talking, what is the desired objective? Where do we want to get to? Is the ideal situation where they will learn, have enough English to then have their complete lesson in English? It will be delivered in English, and they will also do their discussions in English, etc., etc. Of course, the end result of that will be that they won't then be able to discuss maths and science in Arabic, as here, and they will lose their Arabic, if you like, in that context. I think that's a worry in this particular context. And it's interesting what you were saying about in Bulgaria, where they drop the English then to swap, so that then obviously they can bring up back their Bulgarian. I don't know what the policy is going to be here, but I can see there is a worry, a genuine worry there, that they will lose out on their Arabic, which of course they quite possibly would.
One last comment very quickly about Bulgaria. It's actually quite an interesting country because of this intensive foreign language preparation with subjects as well. But unlike the English language, students who study in the German language study their curriculum in the German language. The Bulgarian government has an agreement with the German government that these students have this noted in their school leaving diplomas, so that they don't then have to go on, if they apply to German universities, and do any further language exams. They can apply directly to German universities. That's not the case with England and students in Bulgaria who graduate with the English medium curriculum option. And I imagine these permutations will get more complex in Europe, where there's so much mobility and so much demand young people have now for where they want to study, what they want to study, and how they want to do it.
Yeah, but if you take Qatar, for example, I mean, I'm not sure I agree with what Phil said there. I mean, if you take Qatar and its objective for taking on maths and science, I mean, it's clear that what they want really, and what they've realised is that when and if people are going to be mathematical and scientific in their later lives, let's say, lifelong learning, then it's much more likely to be in English than in Arabic. And there's no evidence to suggest, certainly from this neck of the woods, that beginning concepts, even in secondary, in the foreign language, gets in the way or obstructs the ability of the student at a certain cognitive age to reiterate it all in his or her own language. I mean, we've proved in the Basque Country it's not the case. What happens, for example, in social sciences is that we throw them into social science in English. They do the whole Basque curriculum in English at the ages of 14 to 16. They've done social science before, but not the same kind of stuff. It's history and geography. We proved quite clearly with the control groups, etc. And for example, the first experimental group had to do the exam in Basque, obviously because the control groups were in Basque, and actually got better results. So I mean, I think there's other research evidence around to suggest that the transfer of concepts at a certain linguistic cognitive age isn't a particular problem. I mean, the Bulgarian case, I'm not quite sure what the objective is there, Keith. I mean, maybe they're simply a bit scared that they won't manage to do that stuff, and that's why they go back to Bulgaria.
The truth here is it's a leftover of a previous regime that people see so much value in. The politicians are actually scared to scrap it, I think, in Bulgaria, because it is so popular. But I think the thing I see young people and teachers do here is they're very inventive with languages. My sister's daughter, my niece, is living with us this year, studying in my school in the German profile. And she's very interesting to observe. Poor girl, studying German through Bulgarian. She's English, and she's had to be, out of necessity, very creative in the way she manages all of that. Her German teacher has a bit of broken English. A lot of the kids in her class speak very good English, and amongst them, they've managed to cope with this visitor for a year. And one of the things she does, for example, which I imagine is something a lot of learners of subject material through foreign language try and do, is use technology. She maps the thousands of items of vocabulary that she gets, and verb forms, for example. in the 3 languages using concept mapping software. We haven't talked about vocabulary and managing learning very much. We've got 15 minutes left. You might want to carry on as we're going, or change direction. It's up to you.
Sorry.
Wendy?
Yeah. Hi. Phil Brabs just put me to the post about talking about the danger of learners understanding concepts in the L2 and not in the L1, although Felipe, you've sort of dashed that to smithereens by saying research has showed that. My only very close-up experience of seeing CLIL in action and actually done very badly was in Hong Kong. And we had a silly situation there where the children in the Band 1 schools, because only Band 1 schools at that point where I was living there were allowed to teach through the medium of English. So they were the top children. They could only communicate about in certain subjects in English. They didn't have the vocabulary in their first language. And okay, you might argue, well, Cantonese is only a dialect, so why would you bother? But it actually did cause problems.
We've got an article from Andy Kirkpatrick, who from the Hong Kong Institute of Education, and that might be of interest to people who listen to our discussion. He states one of the myths he deals with is that the best way to learn a second language is to use it as a medium of instruction. I think
don't like that.
most of us here would take exception to that statement, but that's one of the myths he deals with in his article.
Well,
I don't think it is a myth.
I don't either.
And I think it's a very dangerous article. I've read stuff from Kirkpatrick before, and I think the best thing to do is bin it. Sorry.
Well, actually, no. The best thing to do is to take issue with the arguments and give examples like you did, Phil. You know, that the control groups that are investigated in the Basque Country and the Fastolas schools do perform very well using other languages as a medium of learning.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's the most dangerous. For anybody who hasn't read the Kirkpatrick article, in case you do, because Keith very kindly put it up, there's a much worse thing he says on there, just in case you read it. Well, okay, I mean, this is my opinion, but a reasonably informed one. But you know, the idea that Kirkpatrick has, and I read him in the Guardian on this one, that the students have to develop their L1 before they can possibly be doing stuff in L2. Surely is nonsense. You know, I mean, I cannot accept that argument. It might be the case from the Hong Kong situation, but surely the Hong Kong situation was a mess for quite a long time.
Let's let Wendy influence and let's say something about it.
Well, Noreen has also taught in Hong Kong, so she also knows that context. I know Andy Kirkpatrick, and I think I know what he's trying to say. I kind of have to agree with him, actually. I know, Felipe, thank goodness you can't strangle me through the internet. I think that there could be a close relationship between success in CLIL and failure in CLIL, between cultures and the way cultures expect learning and teaching to happen. Now, Hong Kong is what's classified as a Confucian heritage culture, which has probably very strongly stereotypical ways of teaching and learning. And despite all the reforms that have happened over the last 20 years, I suspect that classrooms continue to be very teacher-fronted, despite all the teacher training. I mean, Jean Brewster was there for a long time. She would probably be able to add a lot to this conversation as well. I think there are probably a lot of differences between European-style teaching and learning, values and beliefs, and Confucian heritage culture ones. And that might be a reason why there are differences in successes.
Precisely, I think that I would agree 100% with what you're saying, because I'm not an expert on that situation. But what I'm saying is that Kirkpatrick generalises from that thing you just explained very well, and attempts to generalize from it, which is obviously wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wrong. That's wrong. But I think for the Hong Kong context, I haven't read the article, but I would say from the Hong Kong context, what he's saying and what you've repeated, my understanding, is probably right. But he shouldn't have generalized. That is about Hong Kong.
Okay.
Can I just say something that I experienced in Amsterdam?
Go ahead, and then I think Patty wanted to say something. Go ahead, Noreen.
Oh no, I'll wait for Patty.
Oh, that's okay. Go ahead.
It was a TTO school, or bilingual, CLIL. They taught CLIL in the first 3 years in English. The subjects were in English. Maths was in Dutch. Then they got to year 4, and they reverted to teaching everything in Dutch, apart from English. And the students seemed to cope with it very well. Towards the end of year 3, in many lessons, they were asked questions like, do you know what this word is in Dutch? And they were encouraged to find out what these were in Dutch as a sort of self-independent learning strategy. And that seemed to work very well. And I know the final exams were in Dutch, and some questions are asked in Dutch and you have to answer in English, and vice versa. And it seemed to work very well, as opposed to the Chinese situation in Hong Kong, which I experienced, where both languages were perhaps deficient.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Patty, did you want to say something?
No, I agree with what Wendy was saying. I think it does depend a lot on the way the teachers and the students are used to learning. I mean, here in Spain, there are still quite a lot of teachers in classrooms that are very teacher-centered and textbook-oriented. And in situations where people have tried to just teach a subject in English using the same methodology as always, which is teacher delivering information and using a textbook, it hasn't worked well. And in the places where they've been able to adopt things like group work, giving all of those supports that we need to use to make the language comprehensible, like graphic organizers, writing frames, all of those kind of things, it has worked, and teachers have been quite satisfied. Yes, there's a concern by parents and by some teachers that children won't learn all of that vocabulary in their mother tongue, which in this case is Spanish. A recommendation for that situation is to try to integrate the curriculum where possible. You know, maybe in Spanish class they can do a reading in Spanish about what they've done in English and science, or maybe they can have a homework assignment in Spanish about what's gone on in class in English. So there are ways to deal with that, but definitely the culture and the attitude towards language and learning is a huge influence.
The one example I wanted to just really throw in and mention is the government in Italy made a recent decision to offer all Italian school leavers the option to study one subject through English in their school leaving year, in their maturing year. And this is after several years of kind of dwindling investment in foreign language subject teaching. I don't know why this decision's been made, and talking to colleagues in Italy about this, they raise all this, the familiar worries that we often discuss with teachers, training resources, language level of teachers, and I think it's actually one of the symptoms of education that all countries have to suffer, is that new governments bring new politicians who think within a 4 or 5 year term of office rather than a long term. A project like offering the system through a foreign language, education system through a foreign language, it's going to take generations really to get it right.
Keith, can I ask Egbert, in Germany, for example, does in the gymnasium system, are the students allowed to choose the language that they do their final exams in at the end of secondary schooling, if they've been through a kind of bilingual or CLIL system? Can they choose? I thought they could in Austria, for example.
No, they don't choose, but they can have additional, let's say, biology in English. We call it bilingualer Unterricht, bilingual education in biology. Yeah. And the content is clearly the same, on the same basis, the same the same type as the content and the skills in the German Abitur in biology. So they will have one subject more, bilingual biology.
Yeah.
And this qualifies. Another thing was French. In French, we have bilingual schools who give them a French final exam.
Yes.
To enter French universities with this exam.
Yeah.
I realise it's we've got a couple of minutes before the hour comes up.
Yeah, they can do that.
I wanted to ask a favour from you all before we do close up. I found in previous discussions, because of what we talk about, colleagues who are involved often think of resources or work or research or links or books that come to mind. Do please write and send me anything that our discussion's thrown up, and I will include it in the minutes or links that when I write up the minutes and put them on the factual page for this. Otherwise, I'd quite like to be strict and draw us to a close if that's okay with you, because I know you've all got lives outside teaching. And I'd like to thank you all for coming. It's been a fascinating discussion. And I would like to say, do come back, if you're interested in following up on any of the issues we've discussed. I'll include all of you in a round-robin email when I do write up the minutes and post the recording. And I'll also make a few prompts for future discussions. And invite you, if you do have things that you're particularly interested in, do suggest them to me. And the other thing is, I chair this discussion, but I know some of you have very strong areas of interest, much more competent to talk about than perhaps prepare prompt questions for other colleagues. If you'd like to do that, I'm quite happy to deal with the technical side. If one of you would like to take over, fielding questions and dealing with the discussion. You don't have to answer that now. But I've switched off the recording.